I am guessing that most of us in this room are familiar with a very touching, concise biography of Jesus titled One Solitary Life, penned by a minister almost 100 years ago. If you're not familiar with the title, you will be familiar with these opening lines. He was born in an obscure village, the child of a peasant woman. He grew up in another obscure village where he worked in a carpenter shop until he was 30. He never wrote a book. He never held an office. He never went to college. He never visited a big city. He never traveled more than 200 miles from the place where he was born. He did none of the things usually associated with greatness. He had no credentials but himself. He was only 33. His friends ran away. One of them denied him. He was turned over to his enemies and went through the mockery of a trial. He was nailed to a cross between two thieves. While dying, his executioners gambled for his clothing, the only property he had on earth. When he was dead, he was laid in a borrowed grave through the pity of a friend. 19 centuries have come and gone. But from the time this was penned, it's actually 20 centuries. And today, Jesus is the central figure of the human race and the leader of mankind's progress. All the armies that have ever marched, all the navies that have ever sailed, all the parliaments that have ever sat, all the kings that have ever reigned put together have not affected the life of mankind on earth as powerfully as that one solitary life. You've heard that before, haven't you? And yet somehow reviewing that, it has almost as much same impact on me as the first time that I heard it. Because it's true. It resonates with the reality of Jesus as a person, as the God-man, as well as the impact that Jesus has had upon the human family since he came to this earth. And yet, as we have noticed previously in this particular series, the church is in decline. You can look at many varying resources upon the internet and find that the church is in decline. One documented source stated about a year and a half ago that U.S. church membership falls below a majority for the first time. And again, another resource, Pew Research, states that the secularizing shifts evident in American society show no signs of slowing. The latest survey reveals that the finds of the religiously unaffiliated, that this is going up from a decade ago. Now we can scratch our heads and wonder, why is this? When we think of the writing, one solitary life, and yet we see the evidence around us, we think to ourselves, how has this happened? It doesn't happen all at once. It didn't happen overnight or even in the span of a decade or two. This has been an atmospheric, progressive shift that has happened now over a number of years, hundreds of years. We could look at many reasons for the decline. I'm going to share with you only 4. The causes of decline in belief actually begin probably 500 years ago in an era of history known as the Renaissance. Renaissance philosophy beginning around the 1500s. Now, the Reformation also took place about that same time, but from a secular standpoint, the Renaissance happened, and it can be characterized as questioning everything and believing in nothing. There are more than a few outstanding persons in history who we can associate with the Renaissance, but a couple are David Hume and Immanuel Kant. No one can prove anything. This was characteristic of their writings and what they presented to the public. It is a gateway to relativism. Second cause of decline in belief is higher criticism. Higher criticism as it relates specifically to how one understands the Bible. Skepticism questioned who actually wrote the books of the Bible. This happened in an age of what is known as liberal higher criticism. One scholar associated with this is Julius Wellhausen. He postulated back in the middle to the late 1800s that the first 5 books of the Bible, historically understood to have been written by Moses, were not written by Moses at all. Rather, they were the collective work of at least 4 different authors. It was known as the document hypothesis. Another scholar about that time, F.C. Bauer, said that many of the books of the New Testament were written after the apostles died. Another scholar of that time, Rudolf Bultmann, said that we must remove the myths of the New Testament to discover what the actual message is. Higher criticism. An approach to the Scriptures that doubts its authenticity as having been sourced from the divine mind, written by human beings, but sourced from the divine mind. There was the thought that began to creep in that the Bible is not God's word, but it is man's word about God. This began to have a subtle shift upon the clergy. Ideas begin in what's called the academy. Ideas begin in the universities, but they eventually find themselves into the populace through preachers who adopt those ideas from the universities. A third cause of decline in belief is evolution. Most of us are familiar with Charles Darwin and his work, Origin of the Species, published in 1859. There are many different forms of evolution out there. In Christian communities, it's often referred to as theistic evolution. Don't know how we can quite put those two terms together and have them make sense. But this gained entrance into many church communities, both Protestant and Catholic. And then finally, a cause of decline in belief is societal moral autonomy. There has been what some would refer to even as a rebellion. So there's a weakened conviction in the credibility of the Bible, and this has contributed to the declining moral practices, the convictions that are now no longer convictions, they have been modified. Now, this has been happening periodically throughout human history. We can even go back to an Old Testament example, Pharaoh. As Moses confronted Pharaoh in Egypt and said, "The Lord says, let my people go." But Pharaoh says, "Well, who is the Lord that I should obey his voice?" A sense of moral autonomy, that I am not accountable to a higher being. From a New Testament perspective, we read in Romans 1, as Paul looks back at human history from his day, he refers to those generations before him, that although they knew God, they did not glorify him as God, nor were they thankful, but they became futile in their thoughts, and their foolish hearts were darkened. This is a crash course on Western civilization. Causes of decline in belief. The Renaissance philosophy, getting traction in about the 1500s. Higher criticism that came into the Christian community. Evolution being adopted as as an explanation for our origins, and then societal and moral autonomy. This unconsciously creates a gap. And we've been talking about the gap. To use another picture word, this is the atmosphere that has been developing within our culture and our society, not just for a year or two, not just for decades, but for literally hundreds of years. Occasionally, when you fly into a major metropolitan area, and if the conditions are just right, it will look like there's pollution down on the ground. I think this is a picture of Denver, Colorado. I'm not quite sure. The people that live in the city with pollution are surrounded by it all the time. But if you want to get some really fresh air, you go up to the mountains. And my, oh my, who is that? Man, she's having a good time up in the mountains. Where the air is fresh and clean, and you breathe it in, and you go, oh, that just feels so good to have that fresh air. In our previous time together, we referenced a video that was presented on YouTube from a professor at Southern Adventist University, Alan Parker, in which he relayed the results of a pretty extensive survey that he conducted. The title of his presentation was Stemming the Exodus, and it was an attempt to get into the thinking of those who have stepped away from the Seventh-day Adventist Church, at least for a period of time, and who are younger in the demographic. From his findings, he postulates that approximately 70% of young adults in the Seventh-day Adventist community leave the church. His responses were revealing. 350 of his responses were from those who were less than 35 years of age, and then another 25% of his total responses came from those who were in the age bracket of 35 to 44. So approximately 75% of his responses were the age of 45 and younger. So he asked the question, why did you leave the church? And the number one response that he gained was shocking to me because of doctrinal disagreements. Those who left the church said, I no longer believe what the church, and in this case specifically, the Seventh-day Adventist Church, teaches. Now, maybe they haven't discounted everything, but have discounted a number of significant areas that said, I cannot affiliate with that group anymore because I don't believe what the church is teaching. Some of those responses that he read on his video, and by the way, if you haven't watched the video, take a picture of the screen where you can find the YouTube address and watch the video. I invite you to do that. So he read some of the comments that were offered by the survey respondents. I am finding cognitive dissonance, wrote one. Once you escape the cave and learn what the shadows are, you can't be talked back into the cave. So there was this sense that this person was in some type of a protective bubble, and when they, maybe through going to a public university, they were exposed to new ideas, and they begin to evaluate those, and they said, I'm not sure that lines up with what I was taught. And so there began to be what's called cognitive dissonance, an uncomfortable feeling that things don't match up. Another one commented, I have become an atheist. I have considered arguments from both sides and decided through great pain and anxiety because I'm going to lose some relationships that I no longer believe in any God or supernatural phenomenon. That is very painful. Extremely painful. We could spend a few minutes just on that comment alone and kind of ferret out all of the implications of that. I'm going to lose some relationships. Well, should that be the case? Does that imply that because they have adopted a different belief structure that they just know it's going to be automatic, that their Christian friends are now going to say, I don't want to associate with you anymore? That has implications, doesn't it? But I no longer believe in any God or supernatural phenomenon. The rest of this message is actually going to address that comment. Here's another comment. My experience in the Adventist church has been brainwashing. I have endured this brainwashing, and it has marred my view of God. These are difficult things to read, but we need to listen to them. We need to ponder them and think, are we not communicating effectively? So Parker went on, in his own words then, to observe that what he gained from these comments was that cognitive dissonance, yes, as we've already noted, between Adventist beliefs and their rational beliefs, that there are logic holes, that it's stupid and you can't fix stupid. Now, if you've watched the video, you know exactly what I'm just taking things that he mentioned on his video. Here's another comment. The Adventist church misuses the Bible and denies science. Maybe if the church would embrace science more thoroughly, it would help. That is a very significant statement as well, because it assumes that science is correct. Maybe this person hasn't studied history well enough, but science changes. Science is not always set. What may be true today may not be true from a scientific perspective next year. An example of this, in Noah's day, science said it's impossible for it to rain. It's impossible for there to be a flood. I wonder if Noah, inside the ark, after it started raining and the ark kind of lifted off of its ground foundation, goes, nobody believes you until it starts raining. But then they believe you. So what we want to just dabble with a little bit here for our remaining time together is something known as apologetics, Christian apologetics. Now, apologetics in this context doesn't mean, well, I'm sorry that. No, it doesn't mean an apology of some confession that I made a mistake or I messed up. Apologetics is actually a biblical term for rationale, a reason, a defense. We find this word in 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 15, in which the apostle says, be always ready to give a defense, a reason, an explanation for what you believe. And then he notes, with meekness and fear. So we don't want to come off as being arrogant, but we want to come off as being confident in what we believe, because we've analyzed it. We've done the brain work in order to arrive at our conclusions. So, here's a case for God. I'm not saying it's the case, it's simply a case. Because you can, from an apologetic perspective, make many cases for God. We could look at prophecy, Daniel chapter 2, that particular chapter alone, and how the future of the world was told before it happened, and then history validated that. Another prophetic perspective would come from 8 messianic prophecies that we find in the Old Testament pointing forward to that person who we would come to see as Jesus Christ. 8 prophecies that he fulfilled that he could not manipulate in such a way to self-fulfill them, such as the place of his birth, the manner of his birth, etc. So, a scientist, Peter Stoner, this is many years ago. This is an old thing. This is not a new, fresh, apologetic explanation. Peter Stoner wrote in Science Speaks, and he was a mathematician. What is the probability of one person being able to fulfill these 8 prophecies? It's like 1 to 10 to the 17th power, like 17 zeros behind it. And in order to get a grasp of what that means in reality, he said, and I think it's probably credible, you can take the state of Texas, cover the entire state with silver dollars 2 feet deep, then choose to walk or go by car. You can't really drive on 2 feet deep silver dollars all throughout the state, but somehow make your way out through the state, and your one and only chance to find the marked silver dollar out of the entire state of Texas, that's how likely it is that someone could fulfill those 8 prophecies. It's impossible. So these are apologetic approaches. Oh, we could take the credibility of the Bible. The credibility of the Bible as a document of antiquity and compare it to the documents of other writers of antiquity. The Bible overpowers other documents in the number of manuscripts that are available, the timing of when those writings were first penned, from looking at the events that had taken place. The Bible blows other ancient documents out of the water as far as its manuscript evidence and credibility. But we're not going to look at any of those in detail. Those are just other approaches for cases for God. The case that we're going to look at, and just briefly, and we're not going to exhaust it, is the resurrection. The resurrection of Jesus. Paul states in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, if Christ is not risen, then our preaching is empty, and your faith is also empty. He says a little while later in that same chapter, if in this life only we have hope in Christ, we are of all men the most pitiable. And then he goes on to repeat that thought a third time. If the dead do not rise, let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we die. If the resurrection is not a historical fact, let's just close the doors and invest our time in hobbies and interest groups and whatever else we might want to be involved with. I'm going to provide seven reasons for the resurrection of Jesus. There are more, but here are 7 reasons why the resurrection of Jesus, the bodily resurrection of Jesus, is credible. First, there were eyewitness accounts. 1 Corinthians chapter 15 tells us that there were over 500 people who saw Jesus alive. And Corinthians was written in the mid-50s. This is approximately 25 years after the resurrection had taken place. 2 Peter chapter 1, Peter writes from a testimony, we were eyewitnesses. We saw Jesus alive after he had been crucified and entombed. Second reason, this is in Twitter form, just short, bam, 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 here we go. Second one, embarrassing details. All four Gospels report women as the first eyewitnesses. And this is offensive for us today, but in the culture of that day, women's testimony was not regarded as first rate. Another embarrassing detail is that there are differing accounts. There's no scripted talking points. This tells us that it wasn't made up. The resurrection story of Jesus was not crafted. It was simply the report of those who experienced it. Another embarrassing point is that the men don't believe it initially. Well, that aligns because women were not believable in that particular time and culture. So there are embarrassing details that are included in the resurrection accounts of Jesus in the Bible. Third reason, enemy attestation. What is that? Jesus' enemies admit the tomb is empty. Now, they provide an alternative explanation, but they admit the tomb is empty. Enemy attestation is a powerful testimony that actually favors the opposing view. Fourthly, Jesus predicted that this would happen. Jesus predicted his death and resurrection multiple times. You can see the references there from Matthew chapter 12, Matthew chapter 16, Mark 8, Luke 9, John 10. And this is just a smattering of the gospel references in which Jesus forecasts, he predicts his death and his resurrection. But we'll look at Matthew chapter 12, verses 39 and 40 just a little bit more in detail. So the religious leadership is confronting Jesus, and they say, show us a sign. We want a sign from you to validate your testimony that you are who you think you are. And so Jesus replies with this: as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. Jesus predicted his death and his resurrection multiple times. He predicted this so many times that it became common knowledge. The priests approach Pilate after Jesus is crucified and entombed. That deceiver, Pilate, said that he was going to rise after 3 days. So we need to put a guard at the tomb. Fifthly, there were entirely changed lives as a result of the resurrection. Following the crucifixion, the disciples are skeptical and afraid. But because Jesus is alive, his followers become emboldened. They become empowered to experience persecution and even death. The sixth reason, the emergence of the church. In Acts chapter 17, as recorded there with Paul's ministry in Thessalonica, the observation is made from the residents, those who are opposing the gospel, that these who have turned the world upside down have come here too. The church exploded in those early years, those early decades. And it had an enduring impact. So much so that the big dogs back in the first century, Caesar and Nero, were well known. Who were Peter and Paul? Caesar and Nero were the big dogs in the first century. But now, people name their sons Peter and Paul, and their dogs Caesar and Nero. The emergence of the church is also recognized by writers outside of the Bible. A few of them are Tacitus, Pliny the Younger, Trajan, and Suetonius. So we have 6 reasons here as to why the resurrection is credible. 7th, there are extra biblical accounts of Jesus. Many of those same writers we just noticed a moment ago: Tacitus, Josephus, Lucian, the Talmud, Clement of Rome, Ignatius, Justin Martyr, they refer to the crucifixion of a man named Jesus, or they refer not only to his crucifixion, but also his resurrection. These are just 7 credible reasons as to why we can, with intellectual soundness, believe in the resurrection of Jesus. This is simply a case for God. Now, I don't really endorse popular music artists, but Bob Dylan had a song back in the late 70s that resonates here with this message. Don't endorse Bob Dylan and everything that he sang or everything that he did. But he had a song, just some of you know it. You got to serve somebody. And in his gravelly voice, he would sing, "You may be an ambassador to England or France. You may like to gamble, you might like to dance. You may be the heavyweight champion of the world. You may be a socialite with a long string of pearls. But you're going to have to serve somebody. Yes, indeed, you're going to have to serve somebody. Well, it may be the devil or it may be the Lord, but you're going to have to serve somebody. You may be a businessman or some high-degree thief. They may call you doctor or they may call you chief. You may be rich or poor. You may be living in another country under another name. You may be blind or lame. You may be a construction worker working on a home. You may be living in a mansion or you might be living in a dome. You might own guns or you might even own tanks. You might be somebody else's landlord. You might even own banks. You may be a preacher with your spiritual pride. You may be a city councilman taking bribes on the side. You may be working in a barber shop. You may know how to cut hair. You may be somebody's mistress, maybe somebody's heir. But you're going to have to serve somebody. Yes, indeed. You're going to have to serve somebody. It may be the devil or it may be the Lord, but you're going to have to serve somebody. We would like to think that we're autonomous, that we're neutral, that we're not compelled or accountable to anything or anyone. That's a result of the Renaissance. But we're not autonomous. We are accountable. One day, as Jesus was in the temple teaching, he was challenged with some questions. Who gave you the authority to say what you're saying? Who do you think you are? And Jesus replied with this answer: if anyone's will is to do God's will, he will know whether the teaching, meaning my teaching, Jesus' teaching, he will know whether the teaching is from God or whether I am speaking on my own authority. If anyone's will is to do God's will, he will know whether the teaching is from God or whether I am speaking on my own authority. The book Desire of Ages, which I turn to so frequently as you have come to know, makes these comments on this particular day and this conversation that Jesus was having with the leaders at that time. The perception and appreciation of truth depends less upon the mind than upon the heart. Truth must be received into the soul. It claims the homage of the will. If truth could be submitted to the reason alone, pride would be no hindrance in the way of its reception. But it is to be received through the work of grace in the heart, and its reception depends upon the renunciation of every sin that the Spirit of God reveals. Man's advantages for obtaining a knowledge of the truth, however, great these may be, will prove of no benefit to him unless the heart is open to receive the truth and there is a conscientious surrender of every habit and practice that is opposed to its principles. Now, I don't know. I don't know the person. I don't know their situation, and this could be viewed as somewhat of a judgmental comment, but remember that comment from the survey? I have looked at both sides, and I have come to believe that there is no supreme being. Is it possible that underneath one wants to arrive at that conclusion because one does not want to be accountable to a supreme being? And so you go through a number of mental gymnastics to arrive at a certain level of comfort intellectually. Because if I don't believe in God, then I'm not accountable. Now, I do remember what Peter stated: give an apologia with meekness and fear. But I ask the question, to those who thus yield themselves to God, having an honest desire to know and to do His will, the truth is revealed as the power of God for their salvation. Now, I think that most of you already believe in all of this. I mean, it resonates. It's, oh, yeah, that makes sense. It's so obvious. And I offer it for you today as kind of a refresher so that if you have a conversation in the workplace or with a friend or a family member who's drifting towards that pathway of unbelief, you can simply ask a question. Well, tell me how you arrived at that. I'd like to know. And you may not want to actually respond with anything at the moment. Well, you know, I'll have to think about that. Maybe we can talk about that again someday. Okay. We need to be certain in our minds, though, that there is a credible case for God. And the credibility of our own conviction will be broadened and deepened as we search for God, not just with our minds, but we make ourselves vulnerable in heart as well.